Finally, I am getting around to doing this. 2024 was basically the calm before the Switch 2 storm in terms of Nintendo output. A few hit releases here and there, but not as crazy as the year before. And while I still don't have a PS5 so I can play Astrobot, I still enjoyed the nice mix of Nintendo and non-Nintendo games this year.
Hi, as of May 14th, I have a PS5 now, so you'll see Astrobot next year, maybe, I don't know.
So let's do the annual thing of talking about all of the ones I've beaten in 2024. By the way, since the games I talk about in each installment is sort of random, as they cover both old and new games, there's a spreadsheet in the description that lists every game I've ever mentioned in alphabetical order if you want to see if I've talked about a particular game in the past. And as usual, before we begin, here are the quick-fire honorable mentions. I replayed Super Mario Land again, this time on its overdue release on NSO, played through the PAL version of Super Mario 64 for some reason. Content warning and web fishing are two very different but fun multiplayer experiences that I've enjoyed outside of VR chat this year.
I found this. It's
That
radiation.
feels like it's gonna kill us. Oh my god!
Super Mario Party Jamboree is finally a fantastic original Mario Party in the classic style, only slightly dampened by the fact that they artificially conflate all the different minigame types together so they can technically claim it's the biggest Mario Party game, but whatever. And finally, Tetris Forever is a great combination of a historic Tetris compilation and insightful documentary, and even if you know the history of Tetris inside and out, still offers a fresh perspective on its wild history. Alright, here we go. For the third year in a row, here's every single game I've beaten in 2024. Okay, so imagine a random Nintendo fan was granted a wish. They can pick a single game from Nintendo's catalog no matter how big or small it is, and Nintendo will remake it in HD and give it as much polish as possible. And that fan's favorite game happened to be Mario vs. Donkey Kong on the Game Boy Advance. Yeah, so I don't think a remake of this game was on a lot of people's bingo cards, but it is a great remake of the original. The presentation is mostly preserved in the Switch to 3D models. The cutscenes in particular perfectly made the transition.
Bananas.
And it has its fair share of quality of life improvements, like a faster general pace and better bonus stages. This is my first time actually playing all the way through the first Mario vs. Donkey Kong, and while it's overall not super challenging, there are still several clever puzzles in the later levels, a few of which actually managed to eat through some of my lives. Given this remake's price tag though, there are still a few missed opportunities, like the lack of e-reader levels or bringing back cut content like the level editor. But if you can find it for under $60, I think it's worth a try if you've never experienced the Donkey Kong puzzle platformer formula that was only ever present in 2 games. It'd be cool to see this formula return in a new game someday. In 2022, I went back to NES Remix on the Wii U and played through every challenge there. And here we are 2 years later with Ultimate NES Remix, the 3DS port. I actually bought this game at launch, and it was my first exposure to NES Remix since I didn't own a Wii U back then. But I've finally gone back and gotten 3 stars on all of the stages and unlocked the record roll. I've stated my thoughts on the NES Remix series as a whole before, so I'll just add to that by saying the 3DS version is a nice greatest hits version of the series that looks great and runs incredibly well on 3DS. Funny because the developers used to say that it wasn't technically feasible. It's also funny that getting 3 stars on every stage unlocks a Famicom remix mode that just lets you play the mildly different Japanese versions of the games and do it all over again. It's like the NES Remix equivalent to being able to play as Luigi. I really hope the NES Remix series can return in the future, but, well, we'll talk about what actually happened instead later on. You know, sometimes when a random game from the NES or SNES era just pops into your head and you're like, maybe I should finally play through it shouldn't take me that long. Well, that was me with the original Kid Icarus, specifically the 3D Classics version on 3DS. Kid Icarus always felt to me like one of the less talked about games in the NES library, and yet is also infamous for its inverted difficulty curve, and yeah, they weren't wrong. While the beginning levels can definitely be tough, with the proper save system found in the original Famicom disc version and the remake, it's still pretty manageable. And you do eventually feel the power of every upgrade you come across. Being able to kill Reapers in 3 shots during the late game is incredibly satisfying. And it was also fun to recognize all these enemies that will go on to appear in Uprising. Some parts of the game, like the later dungeons, can still be a little confusing to navigate without a map, just like early Zelda and Metroid. But I do appreciate all the quality of life changes that the 3D Classics version makes, like the improved controls. Definitely the definitive version to play if you're ever interested in trying the series' roots, while waiting for the next game to release in about 12 more years. The PAC is back, for like the 5th time and in the future a 6th. Pac-Man World is the Dot Muncher's transition into 3D. And while it may look like a pretty basic 3D platformer on the surface, for a game originally released on the PS1, it was actually a really nice platformer for the time, incorporating enough Pac-Man elements to give it a unique identity, and it just has a really chill vibe to it that the Re-PAC remix presentation really elevates. Not every 3D platformer has to be Mario or Astrobot levels of grandiose. And just like Kid Icarus, the remake also adds in nice improvements like the upgraded power pellet and flutter kick. The only complaint I really have is that they don't add a drop shadow directly under your character when you jump, and that can lead to some frustration. But this game never demands Crash Bandicoot levels of precision anyway. There's really only one frustrating boss encounter, being the infamous Anubis Rex, but it turns out the original was even harder, so I guess props to the devs for making it more tolerable, I guess. Who am I kidding? I can't get mad at the game where you get to rescue Puka. The online services for the 3DS finally died in April 2024, so before that happened, I wanted to give The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes a try for myself, after previously enjoying Four Swords Adventures on the GameCube, albeit on my lonesome. For a while, it seemed like Triforce Heroes was the black sheep of all the 3DS Zelda games, even ending up in bargain bins at one point from what I recall. But it also just appears to be a straightforward sequel to Four Swords, being another co-op linear Zelda adventure, just with 3 players this time. The game itself is actually perfectly fine to play, especially building off of the engine from A Link Between Worlds. But some of the puzzles and enemy encounters can be pretty demanding and require some serious 3-player coordination, which is probably why this game got mixed reviews back in the day. Back when it launched, Triforce Heroes was best enjoyed through local multiplayer, as the single-player mode is clearly not how it was meant to be enjoyed, and playing it online with strangers comes with the added baggage of not being able to communicate well outside of However, in the year of our Lord 2024, playing online with friends on a barely populated surface while also chatting over Discord, Triforce Heroes does end up becoming an incredibly fun experience. But when I say it sometimes requires serious coordination, I really do mean it. This game honestly didn't need the life system, as it was pretty unforgiving during the last third of the game. But it did also lead to a lot of clutch gaming moments.
White umbrella.
And again, the only thing that matters.
White or red?
Red. Go to. Oh, red.
Okay. Oh my god. Oh my god. We did it.
That was so close. Oh my god.
I really hope fan-made services like Pretendo can continue to keep this game's online alive, because I think it's still very much worth experiencing for Zelda fans. Yes, I finally joined the club that has played the Stanley Parable. I actually managed to go in mostly blind too. The only thing I knew about the game beforehand is that you play as an office worker who gets the opportunity to disobey some omnipresent narrator. And while the game obviously does have a finite amount of branching paths and endings, it still occasionally gave me that magical feeling that there was no way to predict how each playthrough would turn out and the possibilities were almost limitless. A feeling that was achieved in no small feat thanks to the stellar writing and narration. And that's basically all I can say without spoiling it further. If you've heard about this game a lot but never actually tried it like I did, then now is the perfect time, especially with the added content of the Ultra Deluxe version. Yes, I'm playing a AAA non-Nintendo game, originally a PlayStation exclusive, remastered on PC with an Xbox controller. Sound the alarm. I was drawn to the PC release of Insomniac's Spider-Man game partly because I'm interested in this game's take on the Spider-Man universe, but I've also heard everyone else sing the praises of its traversal mechanics. And you know, what better character moveset to traverse your typical AAA open world with than Spider-Man's? So yeah, all the memes about how the game makes you feel like Spider-Man aren't wrong. I was mainly more interested in the exploration and plot more than the combat though. So in the end, I felt the friendly difficulty set a nice balance that also allowed me to get used to the controls and master abilities without being overwhelmed right away. The occasional stealth and puzzle segments are often criticized, but I didn't find them to be too bad of a pace killer, especially since I was the type who actually goes around doing every single side quest before advancing the main story. I'm thinking I'll have ample time to sink into the Miles Morales spin-off and the recently ported sequel. So maybe you'll see those show up here sometime in the future. If you recall, I played Sonic Adventure 1 in 2023. So to prepare for the third Sonic movie, I decided to finally check out Sonic Adventure 2 and yeah, I can see how this game is polarizing nowadays. I'll get this out of the way first. The overall presentation is very neat. Some part of me prefers the lower poly Mario 64-esque style of the original SA1, but this game has its own share of cool cutscenes and set pieces. This stuff is exactly what the third Sonic movie adapted pretty well. But in terms of gameplay, it can be a bit hit and miss. My favorite levels were obviously the speed stages, and it can be fun to blow things up as Tails and Eggman in their stages, but the exploration stages with Knuckles and Rouge definitely took a bit of a hit in terms of enjoyability, and are sometimes mixed with baffling level design choices. In my opinion, Sonic Adventure 1 is a bit more ambitious in scope and gameplay variety, but isn't super refined in parts, while Sonic Adventure 2 is more focused on polishing 3 specific gameplay styles, but also has its own share of weird downgrades compared to the original. I personally enjoyed the physics and controls of SA1 more, but in the end it does seem to come down to individual preference as to which Sonic Adventure is better. I still stick by what I said about SA1 though, and hope Sega revisits this formula someday. For now though, we'll see if I eventually ever get to playing Sonic Heroes. Okay, so I did first hear about Animal Well because of Donkey, but let's discard all the Donkey big mode marketing for this game for a second, because Animal Well is absolutely a fantastic Metroidvania even on its own merits. Being developed from scratch by one Billy Basso over 7 years, this game has the moody atmosphere nailed perfectly. You play as a nondescript blob trying to survive in a hostile world filled with animals, and without any dialogue, the game still manages to emphasize that feeling through its gameplay. It's one of those extremely non-linear games where you can just chart your own path and have to figure things out on your own. And it's super fun to discover all the uses for your upgrades and use them to bypass certain sections of the game. And of course, you can't talk about Animal Well without mentioning the layers of secrets buried in the game for true completion. It's kinda hard to talk about it without spoiling it outright, so to do so vaguely, while I wasn't part of the community who banded together over weeks to discover and solve every ARG-esque element hidden deep in the game, I still very much commend the effort. It's really cool to see a game have this many hidden secrets, and it kinda brings me back to a simpler time. Also, did I mention this game is just 33 megabytes? How does this guy do it? Oh my god. Dude, it's Paper Mario the Thousand-Year Door. Like, I don't need to say anything else, right? Given the recent state of Paper Mario, with fans of the classic and modern games occasionally clashing, I think this remake is the ideal conclusion to this saga we've experienced for the past 12 years. Classic Paper Mario fans can appreciate that the original game has been remade near perfectly, adding both big and small improvements to the gameplay and addressing some issues from the original, and even adding in extra fan service bosses. And modern Paper Mario fans will enjoy the fact that TTYD has been translated to the presentation style of modern Paper Mario extremely well, with an absolute banger of a remixed soundtrack that once again got snubbed at the Game Awards as usual. Sorry, I got kinda lost track there for a second. I really think the only objective flaw here is the halved FPS compared to the original, but that is in no way a deal breaker, at least to me personally. If you're watching this and somehow haven't played the Thousand-Year Door yet, this is absolutely the perfect opportunity. I guess now we'll just wait and see what's next for the Paper Mario series, but I'm pretty optimistic we'll see a new entry that mixes the best of both the classic and modern games. Look, if Mario Party can do it, then Paper Mario totally can. Alright, before we move on, I need to dedicate this brief section of the video to the Playdate. You might have heard me mention it before in my Pioro video, but yeah, I still really like this tiny little handheld. It's definitely a breath of fresh air in a world where a lot of handhelds are basically just going for the Switch's form factor but bigger. And it actually does have the great games and indie support to show for it. Like I said before, it's basically the Ouya but done right. Now, each time the Playdate gets mentioned online, two common downsides are often brought up. The first is the non-backlit screen, but this is actually a unique reflective screen technology that can almost pass for a glossy e-ink display. I've never had any visibility issues with it, unlike older Game Boys, and it's very refreshing to have a handheld screen that's perfectly visible even in bright sunlight. The second is the $199 US price tag, which is understandably steep for some people, considering you can grab a Switch Lite at that price point. But I think this isn't really meant to be a one or the other kind of purchase. It's a perfect supplement on top of all these great handhelds for those looking for a more indie-oriented experience in a quirky form factor. And if you have the disposable income for it, I think this is a reasonable price for boutique gaming hardware from an independent company that actually has proper support and an open development platform. And even though it's trying to look like a classic handheld, the Playdate is no slouch. I've seen it run some visually dense 2D games and even some 3D ones too. And yes, it runs Doom. Not a fake watered down version of Doom, I mean Doom. Now, the reason I'm giving the Playdate its own section rather than just talking about the games I played on it is because there are quite a lot of games I tried on the Playdate. Some big, some small, some aren't even games at all. But I guess I still have my arbitrary rule of just talking about games with definitive endings here. So here's an incredibly quick lightning round of Playdate games that I've seen through to the end, both from the Season 1 games that you get for free and stuff I've gotten from the store or sideloaded. Alright, we're ready? Casual Birder, a fun mix of top-down adventure and Pokemon Snap. Using the crank as a focus slider is really cool. Crankin's Time Travel Adventure, probably the most inventive use of the crank from the creator of Katamari Damacy. Lost Your Marbles, pretty basic plot with a convoluted branching PAP system, but an interesting take on the marble labyrinth genre once you get used to the controls. A joke that's worth 99 cents. I suffered my whole way through the entire joke. Is it worth 99 cents? P-Racing, really cool racing game that doubles as a graphical showcase. Life's Too Short, a cute 30-minute adventure game that highlights the Playdate's ability to host short but sweet experiences. Celeste Classic, a fantastic free port of the original version of Celeste. Stars of the Screen, you can mess with classic Windows screensavers and more on the Playdate with bonus secrets. What's not to love about that? And finally, Duck Game. No explanation necessary. Alright, next up we have a bit of a marathon, since with the addition of Metroid Zero Mission to Nintendo Switch Online, I figured now would be a good time as any to finally hop into the 2D Metroid series. And what better way to start than the definitive remake of the original NES game? Like a lot of people have already said, Zero Mission is absolutely a perfect beginner's 2D Metroid game, with some extra additions that serve as a neat expansion of the series lore. I can't believe they finally let Metroid crawl. Some people may not like the additional handholding and waypoints that have been added, but come on, you've seen the original NES Metroid, right? I first played that back during the 3DS Ambassador program and had no idea what I was doing. And the obtuseness of it was also probably why I wasn't as interested in checking out the rest of the Metroid series as time went on. Yes, 12-year-old me was an idiot, so don't make the same mistake he did. If you have played for your own share of Metroidvanias but somehow haven't touched the 2D Metroid games, definitely give Zero Mission a shot. And hey, maybe you randomly decide to go on a 2D Metroid binge like I did. Case in point, I had a lot of different options at my disposal as to which version of Metroid 2 I should play. The Game Boy original is about as antiquated as the NES game, and while I was interested in Samus Returns, that remake made quite a few changes and additions that will later be revisited in Metroid Dread, so I figured it would be better to try that later in preparation for Dread. So seeing as I've played Zero Mission, I might as well go for the closest equivalent remake for Metroid 2 and give the fan-made AM2R a shot. It retains a lot of things that made Zero Mission fun to explore around, but adds its own quality of life additions on top of that, as well as some atmospheric inspiration from the Prime games apparently, because the soundtrack and presentation are top-notch. Compared to Samus Returns, it definitely conveys more of the original's morally ambiguous theme of, space genocide. This is an incredibly solid Zero Mission equivalent for Metroid 2 and an impressive fan effort. It's just a shame it had to be taken down due to it coincidentally clashing with Samus Returns, but spoilers for later on, they're both good Metroid games. Welp, here it is, the one everyone loves and for a very good reason. Super Metroid is the entry that pretty much set the standard for every 2D Metroid game since, and arguably every Metroidvania game even. And coupled with the lore and unparalleled atmosphere of Planet Zebes, it's sometimes pretty crazy to think that this is what Nintendo managed to follow up the NES and Game Boy entries with. So yes, I absolutely respect Super Metroid for being a pioneer. That being said, seeing as I was coming into Super Metroid from two different remakes that had the opportunity to improve upon this game's specific mechanics, I would be lying if I said I didn't occasionally miss some of the quality of life features that were added to the later games and remakes. I feel like with a few more rough edges being smoothed out, this would truly be a perfect entry in the series. Which I suppose is what some fan-made ROM hacks out there have taken upon themselves to do. But I am playing this on NSO, so, save states will have to do. Still though, I'm glad I finally got to play through this classic. Metroid Fusion, from what I can tell, seems to be one of the more divisive entries in the 2D Metroid series, mainly for two reasons. One of them is the larger focus on narrative and dialogue, which I didn't really mind because I do enjoy some Metroid lore, and this game's plot is definitely one of the most important in regards to that lore. The other is the more linear gameplay experience, with the world divided into sub-levels and you're mostly given directions on where to go at any given time. I'm the type that usually prefers not getting too lost in my Metroidvanias, so this wasn't too big of a deal to me. The act of traversing these areas still feels as great as it did in Zero Mission, yes I know Zero Mission came later, and Fusion in particular nails the feeling of starting off weak but progressively getting stronger incredibly well. Really, the only downside is that I don't get to backtrack much until the very end of the game because areas get randomly gated off for story reasons. Before I continue onto Metroid Dread though, there's a few sidetracks I wanted to make. You were probably wondering throughout this Metroid segment, and yes, I also wanted to try Metroid Other M despite its infamous reputation. It is part of the 2D Metroid chronology after all. Let's just ignore the story for a second though and actually talk about the gameplay. Because as someone who hasn't played the Prime games yet, the gameplay is fine. This is actually a pretty decent translation of the 2D Metroid formula into 3D. With the only downsides being the continuation of the gated linear progression seen in Fusion, and yes, the weird control scheme. The Super Paper Mario style of control where you point at the screen to fire missiles sounds clever on paper, but is absolutely a chore during hectic moments like boss fights. This game was begging to be controlled by a Wii Remote and nunchuck instead. And the story is, well, if there's one thing you know about Metroid Other M, it's the story. And from the perspective of a newcomer who's been marathoning through the entire series, while I admire the intention to make the world feel more cinematic, this is such a jarring tone shift from the previous games that kind of falls into so bad it's good territory. Like it ends up being so corny that just like Detective Pikachu Returns, I found it enjoyable just to riff on the cutscenes with friends in a Discord call. I will give the game some credit though, the cutscene that triggers the final escape sequence was pulled off perfectly. 0 notes. If you know, you know. Time for a quick detour away from Metroid because, yeah, Nintendo World Championships NES Edition was a thing. This game definitely raised some eyebrows when it was first announced, or leaked I guess. On the surface it really felt like a lesser version of NES Remix, and to a certain extent I suppose that is true because I definitely missed the remixes and really wouldn't have minded getting a new entry in that series instead. However, the recontextualization of that formula into challenges themed around speedrunning was done really well. Like I said in the previous video, this game pushed me to try speedrunning challenges in games I'm not super familiar with, like Zelda 1 or Kid Icarus. And it is a pretty unique experience that you can't get just by booting these games up in an emulator. I can totally see this game being a great starting point for people interested in dabbling in basic speedrunning, minus all the, advanced glitching. The one major downgrade compared to NES Remix though is the lack of a permanent online leaderboard for individual challenges, which is baffling when the game is all about speedrunning. The randomized weekly challenge format might not be as appealing to most people, I know I dropped off of it after a few weeks. That said, it was still fun to go through all the individual challenges, unlock all the icons, scroll through the surprisingly comprehensive list of NES and Famicom releases, and conquer the final legendary trial. As for the local multiplayer mode, I've tried it once, and while these speedrunning challenges lend themselves decently well to multiplayer, I still think it works best with people who are familiar with the entire lineup of games presented here, despite the addition of tutorials and practice modes to help out the newcomers. This mode sometimes makes me feel like a fighting game player who's too good to enjoy playing against friends but not good enough to play competitively, you know? That being said, I will still happily look forward to the SNES edition that's up next. I mean, you guys are doing that next, right, Nintendo? I don't think a third Famicom Detective Club installment was on anyone's 2024 bingo card, but shoutouts to the person who correctly predicted a third entry when they released the initial Emio teaser. Emio the Smiling Man feels exactly like a continuation of the first 2 Famicom Detective Club games in both a good and bad way. Let me rewind things a little though, I enjoyed the remix of the first 2 games when they were released in 2021. It was great to be able to experience an official localization of these games for the first time, but the menu and progression system definitely still had that dated feel you'd expect from one of the earliest pioneers in the visual novel genre. It's something you may have to get used to, and while Emio has an independent story that doesn't require knowledge of the first 2 games, it still keeps the same gameplay mechanics mostly intact, maybe with a few more hints sprinkled in to nudge you in the right directions. But having some familiarity with how the series usually plays is still useful. For example, knowing you might have to talk to someone about the same subject multiple times to advance a conversation, or literally examine someone's face when they stop responding, etc. This definitely didn't get in the way of my enjoyment of the story though, which without spoiling, I found incredibly interesting the way they handled the antagonist and how the narrative puzzle pieces fit together at the end. To put it in perspective, this game actually gave me one of the most surprising endgame experiences since Super Mario Odyssey. So yeah, don't let the slightly dated gameplay system deter you from experiencing peak Nintendo fiction. Oh hey, they finally re-released the Ace Attorney Investigations games and localized the second entry for the first time. I've tried both games before, but just like Ghost Trick, it was a really long time ago, to the point I really only remember a handful of memorable moments. But I guess I should be glad I've forgotten most of the plot, especially for Investigations 2, because when the story gets going here, it's just as engaging as the traditional Ace Attorney games at their peak. It does occasionally have a few brain-racking moments, in particular the kidnapped turnabout from the first game I thought got a bit convoluted and confusing, but aside from that, the Investigations games are a cool twist on the Ace Attorney formula. I really like how a lot of recurring characters from the mainline games get another chance to shine here, and I hope the new characters introduced in these games can show up in future mainline games as well. Come on Capcom, you've now remastered pretty much every Ace Attorney game aside from the latent crossover. I think the world is finally ready for AA7. Back to the Metroid grind with Samus Returns on the 3DS. Like I said, even though I got my Metroid 2 fix through AM2R, Samus Returns is a remake with a completely different vibe, with its overhauled 2.5D presentation and focus on more aggressive combat, which I wanted to get used to here to prepare myself for Metroid Dread. It can get a little challenging at times, especially with the revamped bosses, but there's at least some generous checkpoints sprinkled throughout the game, and once you get the hang of combat, blasting through rooms with your powered up moveset can be, well, a blast. Even the map layouts have gotten a small remix, so coupled with the new art style, I barely recognized any set pieces from my AM2R playthrough. This was almost like going through a separate new 2D Metroid game. As for the inevitable question of which Metroid 2 remake is better, I guess AM2R is more of the definitive experience in terms of the story and atmosphere that the original game wanted to communicate. There's a pretty good Game Maker's Toolkit video all about that. But as an alternate take, Samus Returns is still really solid. And lastly, I didn't find a good space in this section to mention it, but this is one of the last 3DS games where they really went all in with the 3D effect, and it looks really good. Definitely check this out on original hardware if you can. The Plucky Squire comes to us from James Turner and Jonathan Biddle, the former being an ex-graphic designer at Game Freak who designed several Pokemon from Gen 5 to Gen 8 and directed Harmonite on the 3DS. If you've seen some of his artwork on social media previously, then his art style should be pretty recognizable all over this game. The storybook aesthetic already looks super charming, but what definitely grabbed a lot of people's attention was the A Link Between Worlds style mechanic where you can pop out of the storybook and explore an incredibly detailed desktop in a child's room. It looks very impressive on PC, but this game isn't just simple eye candy. It does contain a fair bit of Zelda-style top-down puzzle solving with the occasional minigame thrown in. Anything that references Rhythm Heaven gets a plus in my book. Though I've seen a bit of criticism online about this game being overly wordy and handholdy. The wordy part I can kinda let slide, it is a game about a storybook after all, and the story scenes are definitely part of the charm. And yes, while this game isn't necessarily challenging, with its multiple mechanics being more of a jack-of-all-trades situation, that really isn't something I look for in this type of game. It's pretty much as cozy as going through the main campaign of a Kirby game. The only complaints I really had during my playthrough are that the game has a few missable collectibles and a few softlocks happened along the way. Though since then, those bugs seem to have been addressed with new patches, which actually also adds in a streamlined mode for people who prefer less wordy cutscenes. So if you were on the fence before, this might be a good excuse to jump in. If you're looking for a charming little adventure game or something simple but incredibly polished for a kid to start with, I'd say this game is a perfect choice. They finally did it, they made Zelda a girl. It's weird to think that it's been more than a decade since the last traditionally structured 2D Zelda game, and we've only gotten Triforce Heroes and the Link's Awakening remake since. In the case of Echoes of Wisdom, while the overall game does build upon what was seen in the Link Between Worlds and the Link's Awakening remake, including sprinkling in diet versions of Breath of the Wild elements like side quests and recipes, the main sticking point of the gameplay is obviously the Echo system, which from the initial review of the game seemed incredibly creative on paper. So is this the definitive overhaul that 2D Zelda desperately needed? Well, for starters, this definitely doesn't render the traditional swordplay plus item style obsolete. It really feels like its own unique gameplay style, and will certainly take some getting used to at the start before you can fully settle into that gameplay loop you've come to expect from 2D Zelda. I really admire Grezzo's ambition here, but yes, the system is definitely not flawless. It still sometimes runs into the inherent issue where you end up only sticking to a small set of echoes throughout the game. On one hand, each player will still naturally gravitate towards different preferences, so there's no single solution for anything, which can lead to some fun moments of ingenuity during puzzle solving. But later on in the game, you can get stronger and stronger echoes that can eventually replace other solutions outright, especially for stuff like combat. It's understandably a very delicate game balance to maintain, but in the end, I still found the ecosystem fun enough that I didn't even mind the occasional assault on the frame rate. It may not click for everyone, but I personally would rank this on par with A Link Between Worlds. Just please add a few more rows to the item selection UI in future games though. I know you did it on purpose to encourage experimentation or whatever, but just please, come on. Alright, last game in the 2D Metroid journey, Metroid Dread. And let me just say, playing Samus Returns right before this was absolutely a good idea, because they weren't kidding when they said this is the most challenging 2D Metroid game. It takes the already aggressive combat system in Samus Returns, dials it up to 11, and the many bosses in the game will require a lot of pattern learning. Dying a lot will almost certainly be a thing. But hey, I did manage to tough it out until the very end, even with a few late game encounters bordering pretty close to frustration for me. Combat aside though, even when you're just exploring every nook and cranny of Planet ZDR, this is definitely the best feeling Metroid game. I love the new movement options and the improved Eon abilities from Samus Returns, and this is probably the coolest iteration of Samus Aran so far, both in terms of story and gameplay. And I haven't even touched on the Emio yet. Before I knew more about the game, I really thought these things would be giving me the most trouble, given all the focus on stealth and how they're invincible and instant kills so you gotta run away from them, but it actually ended up being pretty fun to plot an escape route on the fly as you try to escape them, and they never felt like they overstayed their welcome. I didn't die to the Emio as often as I did to the regular bosses, and pulling off the occasional counter against them is incredibly satisfying. Metroid Dread is definitely up there with Zero Mission and AM2R in my hypothetical 2D Metroid tier list. And now, time to wait 10 years for Metroid 6 like everybody else. In the meantime though, maybe I'll get started on the Prime series. I did get this copy of Prime Remaster along with my copy of Dread. We're ending the year of the Mario RPG Renaissance with Mario and Luigi Brothership, the one new original entry of the Mario RPG Brothers, and yeah, the one of a more slightly mixed reception among the fanbase. So as someone who got their start with the Mario and Luigi games with the 3DS entries, I actually ended up liking Brothership more than I expected. Going in, I know that things are going to be different since we have a new developer at the helm, but the folks at Acquire have managed to freshen things up while mostly retaining the core identity of Mario and Luigi. The art style in particular made a near-perfect transition to 3D. And while I do miss Yoko Shimomura, this new soundtrack by Hideki Sakamoto absolutely grew on me as I played. And the different instrumentation really helped give this game a unique identity compared to something like Paper Jam. You'd think this soundtrack would be on Nintendo Music by now. No, I'm sure most of the public complaints directed towards Brothership are towards the overall pace of the game. In particular, the pretty slow beginning, which, yes, I do have to concur. This game actually starts pretty abruptly, just randomly isekaiing Mario and Luigi into a completely new world and immediately teaching you about the core gameplay loop of exploring islands and connecting them, without a lot of solid story or gameplay incentive in place yet to encourage you to do so. It takes quite a few hours of playing before the new characters start to get more fleshed out, or even for the Mario mainstays to show up. Bowser and his minions only show up like halfway through the game. But when the story does get going, it's cool to see the cast grow and evolve as you help the people of Concordia out, Techniki my beloved. And while the endgame is also pretty long, it has some of the coolest set pieces I've seen in the Mario RPG since Super Paper Mario. Despite its slower pace, none of it is bogged down by tutorials like Dream Team. And the way the world is divided into several islands means you can divide your playtime into decently sized chunks. And while the combat system does make a few changes that series veterans may have to get adjusted to, I also really like the battle plug system that encourages you to mix and match between different battle effects more than the original badges did. So yeah, while there are some minor issues in pacing and performance, I don't think this stops Brothership from being a great entry in the series. And I really hope it still gets to continue on alongside Paper Mario. Seeing as all three of the Mario RPG brothers seem to have sold well for their respective franchises, here's hoping more new entries will be coming our way soon. Mind Over Magnet is a simple little platform puzzle game about magnets. You play as a robot trying to escape a factory with the help of a few talkative magnets, so throughout the game you're tossing them around and dealing with force fields, buttons, gates, and other contraptions as you make your way out. It's a pretty polished experience with a bunch of clever puzzles, but it is pretty short, only around 1.5 to 2 hours long at most. Some might even say it's forgettable and doesn't really stand out from the crowd of puzzle games. And while I personally find this game perfectly fine on its own merits, I can see some rudimentary form of this game existing as the free Flash game in the late 2000s or something, I think to get the most out of this game, you really have to know the context in which it was made. Mind Over Magnet was developed by Mark Brown, creator of the YouTube channel Game Maker's Toolkit, and was part of a video series called Developing, where he basically documented every aspect of the development of Mind Over Magnet over 3 years, from learning Unity from scratch to avoiding scope creep to doing actual puzzle design and playtesting, and eventually polishing and shipping the game on Steam. It is an incredibly revealing look at what it takes to make a video game from absolute zilch, while offering game design insights that I think both developers and players can enjoy. I followed this video series from beginning to end, and to be able to play the end result for myself after more than 3 years is legitimately pretty cool, even if it means most of the enjoyment I get from it is more from the meta aspects rather than the actual puzzle game itself. But either way, while I do recommend watching the entire Developing series before checking out the game, as it really is one half of a complete package, Mind Over Magnet is still a short but sweet time on its own, even if it wouldn't have gotten as much publicity as it did if it wasn't made by a YouTuber with over 1 million subscribers. Alright, what's the last game I beat in 2024? Huh. Okay. Disney's Magical Mirror starring Mickey Mouse. So let me get this straight. Capcom, who worked with Disney to create multiple well-received 2D platformers in the past, including DuckTales and the Magical Quest series, collaborates with Nintendo and brings on Shigeru Miyamoto as co-producer to make a 3D Mickey Mouse game for the GameCube, and the result was a basic point-and-click adventure game for kids. Well, this game perfectly does its job in that regard. It's got a decent amount of Luigi's Mansion style exploration, and there's even a parent assist feature if you plug in a second controller, you know, to really bring home the point that I'm not this game's target audience. It's just that the entire vibe of this game in general just feels surreal. There's barely any dialogue or other characters, it's just Michael in a liminal space dream world trying to escape. It does try to bring in some of that wacky cartoon energy via the trick system, where you can basically play pranks or manipulate the world in weird ways to progress the game, and if there's one thing to commend this game for, I think it's the graphics and animation. For an early GameCube game, I think it graphically still holds up and has a unique cartoony charm. You certainly can't say that for most licensed kids games today. That being said though, the pace of the gameplay is an absolute drag. Cutscenes take forever to go through, and there's a lot of backtracking and going through the same events multiple times just to progress. The only saving grace being that this game has a few surprisingly random moments here and there that makes it sometimes really unsettling to kids and entertaining to adults. There aren't a lot of games where you can see Mickey Mouse literally throw Hadoukens. But yeah, I just find this game mildly interesting as a weird standout relic of the GameCube era. It's a neat game to add to my collection, but you'll probably find just watching a walkthrough if any of that sounded intriguing to you. So yeah, that's every game I beat in 2024. Not the longest list this time, but hey, if the Switch 2 is any possible indication, you might see this list expand a bit next year, who knows. As always, feel free to let me know your thoughts on any of the games I've mentioned here in the comments. And until next time, I'm really gonna have to get back to the other scripts I've been working on before Nintendo really blows the doors open on the rest of their Switch 2 plans for the year. Don't have our anniversary celebration 3D Mario game quite yet, but I am very much looking forward to Donkey Kong Bonanza. You know what's the real crime though? Next year's video about all the games I beat in 2025 will not include Rhythm Heaven Groove. This is a terrible reality.